My name is Debo Aderibigbe. I'm a product manager here at Google Cloud, and I'm joined by my colleague, Stephen Elliott, also a product manager here at Google Cloud. And we focus on creating value for you guys, the customers and partners, by focusing specifically on the billing product area. Now, I know we're going to go over a lot in our session today, and don't fret if you miss anything. There's going to be a recording available on YouTube after the conference is over. But more specifically, today we want to focus on helping you make your dollar go further with GCP. Now, in order to do that, we're going to go over 4 main areas today. The first is an introduction, the what, the why, the how of using GCP. We're then going to move into how you can drive value using GCP products. Then we'll focus on what cost management tools you can use in order to ensure that you're driving that value, but also saving your costs. And then finally, we'll wrap up and review. So, without further ado, let's go into our introduction. Now, there's the obvious question we have to answer first. Why are businesses moving to Google Cloud? It's a great question. When most companies are transitioning to cloud, the first thing they're often looking to do is to reduce their costs. But that's not all. From developers and DevOps to C-level and board-level initiatives, companies are looking to take advantage of not just reducing costs, but increasing efficiency, increasing reliability, and making sure they have great security. Essentially, Google helps you better engage with your customers. It also helps you better engage with your partners, and it helps you increase the productivity of your employees by making sure both your needs are met and you have room for further innovation. Now, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So indulge me for a moment in a mental picture by means of an analogy. Pizza. Who doesn't love pizza? Now I'm going to go off script a little bit and say pizza is like one of the best meals ever, so bonus tip, you can have pizza for any meal. But just going back to the point, there are 2 different ways you can think about pizza for the means of this analogy. The first is on-premises pizza. That's the pizza that you make. And then there is Google Cloud Pizza. That's the pizza that we make. As you can see, there's a number of different tasks associated with making on-premises pizza. And each of those tasks, including spending the time to go get the ingredients, spending the gas, spending the money, and of course, the thing you can never get back, time, are actually pretty high when it comes to making that on-prem pizza yourself. But when you go with Google Cloud Pizza, it's really simple and fairly elegant. You go online, you order the pizza, you wait, and you enjoy that tasty goodness. When you're going to make the analogy between pizza and being on premises, it's really similar to how you deal with your IT infrastructure. What you focus on is dealing with all the varieties on premises of tasks that you need to do, and we focus on our side of extracting all the management that you have to do with those tasks and doing it for you. So really, when it comes down to it, we're making sure that you get the most value out of it. On top of that, we help you answer questions that are fairly difficult to answer on your own on premises. Like, what if I want a specialty pizza? All the meats, all the veggies. What if I want to make hundreds of pizzas and deliver them to my customers? We help you scale. So that brings us to the main context of our talk today, which is thinking about the base equation of where I get my net value from. The big idea that most companies typically think about is that lift and shift means extracting the value from moving to cloud by just thinking about reducing my total costs and then seeing that as the total net value. Now, that's true. Reducing your total costs is a great thing. But the fact of the matter is, it's not an adequate way to think about the big picture. The truth about cloud is that lifting and shifting your workloads is not really the entire picture and does not transform your IT by itself. Instead, you should really think about bridging the gaps in between your current business processes and the modernization and the innovation you can achieve by moving to cloud. The more and more you use GCP's technologies, the more and more you're able to accelerate the amount of value you capture from moving to cloud. So I like to think about this as kind of an iceberg picture. In this instance, there's the obvious costs, which are using your compute, using your other resources on the cloud. But then there's the less obvious costs, like all it takes to maintain that infrastructure on premises. And then there's the value that you get from abstracting away your concerns about all the cloud work you do on premises to the cloud. And then there's the less obvious value you get, such as efficiencies, productivity, reliability, security. So let's alter this equation just a little bit to make sure that we get the full value of moving to cloud. Really, the change in net value that you can enjoy when you move to cloud is really the total value of being in the cloud itself, all the things I just mentioned, and then you subtract from that the total costs. Now, for all of you guys who are saying, Debo, it's way too early for me to be doing math this morning, let's simplify it. Just think about your total value and just think about your total costs. This has worked fantastically for our friends over at Vendasta. They focused on doing just that, getting their value out of a lot of GCP products, and then analyzing that value using BigQuery and a number of cost management tools. They've been able to grow their business by 32% while keeping their costs relatively flat. Now, I imagine a lot of you could do the same thing by using Google Cloud. So let's stop talking about this in an abstract way, and let's talk about it in a little bit more concrete way. Let's focus on GCE, or Google Compute Engine, as one of the first products we can show you how to drive more value. The typical costs of compute ownership are spread across a number of elements. One of them is the building. You gotta pay the rent. You gotta cover the electricity, the lighting, the AC, and the security. You've gotta think about the software, operating systems, management utilities, software licenses. You've also gotta think about people, all the specialists, the consultants, your employees, and HR. Oh yeah, there's one more thing we forgot, the hardware. You've got to make sure that your compute is taken care of on premises so you can actually run the workloads you care about. So there's not just that you have to think about as well. You also got to think about how you actually drive the value of your business. Let's start with the hardware costs. Every 18 months or so, your hardware more or less becomes out of date. And to keep that up to date has a cost associated with it if you want to make sure that you remain competitive with those in your industry. You also want to take advantage of all kinds of innovations that are fairly expensive to come up with your own on-prem, such as GPUs, TPUs, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. You also want to think about how you might serve a new region of the world, let's say if you want to globally expand, or let's say that your business is doing fantastic and you want to make sure you can scale very quickly, especially if it's not expected. And so that's where we enter Google Compute Engine. The simplicity and elegance of it is its core value. You start the virtual machines that you need for your workloads when you need them, you resize them and scale as necessary, and then you shut down that VM when you're not using it anymore. The key to that is you pay only for what you need. Well, you guys didn't come for the basic explanation of what a virtual machine is or how to use it, so you really came for finding out how you can drive even more value out of using GCE and other products. And that's very simple. I like to spread it into two elements, behaviors and tools. On the behavior side, you definitely want to analyze and plan your workloads. Think about seasonality. Think about the duration. Think about the value of your workloads. Are they mission critical? Figure out how you want to segment those and use the right machines for them. The second thing I tell you to do is think about virtual machine types or families. Now, we offer a number of different ones. Of course, there's general purpose VMs, but there's also different optimized VM families that you should take advantage of. For example, compute optimized VMs if you want to think about performance, or memory optimized VMs if your storage is very important to you, or platform optimized VMs if you're thinking about specific types of operating systems or platforms that you want your virtual machines to run on. Then, of course, the third behavior you really want to focus in is resize the VMs as necessary. Think about VMs being built of core and RAM and sometimes additional attributes like attached persistent disk or other things like that. make sure that you're using the right size for what you need. When we move over to the tools part of what you're going to do with your VMs, you want to make sure to take advantage of the Stackdriver API. Now, the Stackdriver API is fantastic because it's really giving you logging, monitoring, and alerting right at your fingertips programmatically. On top of that, we give you what we like to call right-sizing recommendations. Right-sizing recommendations allow you to have the proper size of VM after we've watched you use those VMs for a given period of time in order for you to save money or be efficient in the way you use them. And finally, there's a number of other tools that we'd like for you to use, such as VPCs or sole tenancy, which means just having your workloads alone on a VM, access control, snapshotting of disk images to make sure that you can get quickly running with your VM, and other types of tools like that. Now, I told you in that equation earlier that I mentioned, it's not just about value, it's about decreasing costs as well. So let's take a look at a few of the ways you can do that. We have custom machine types. One of the things that's interesting about all those predetermined machine types that I just mentioned in the previous slide is that they tend to follow a specific ratio of core to RAM. If you need to, you can break that ratio and have a custom machine type that's flexible and well priced. If you want to have a workload that can withstand some interruption, let's say once every 24 hours, you might want to think about using preemptible VMs. Preemptible VMs might get preempted, as their name suggests, and they're cheaper. You can also use sustained use discounts. Now, this is a great thing that you get automatically for long-running workloads. When your workload's going to run on a specific type of family, the longer and longer you use it, the more of effective discounting you get. And finally, there's committed use discounts. When you commit to using a certain amount of core and RAM per month on a 1 or 3 year basis, we're able to effectively scale and plan capacity for you. That planning equals savings on our part, and we're more than happy to share the discount with you. Now, I've talked a little bit more specifically about GCE, but there's a number of different benefits you can enjoy across all GCP products. And that includes, but it's not limited to, the fact that we have planetary scale and networking. These are not just the services we're using to help you, but they're also the same types of services we use to run many of our most famous products, like YouTube, Gmail, and G Suite. We also have site reliability and support. Think about them as very, very intelligent babysitters for your workloads, making sure that your precious workloads don't do anything weird while you need them to run. We're backed by Google Security, which of course, I don't need to tell you how important it is to be secure when you're running your workloads. And we've got GCP-wide tooling, logging, and APIs to connect you to all the resources that you need. So let's kind of move forward in the compute spectrum, where my partner, Stephen, is going to talk to you a little bit about all the value you can extract from products in the compute spectrum in terms of different ways to manage them.
All right, thanks, Debo. So I'll spend a little time talking about managed compute. And this is where we move from being able to provision virtual machines to actually managing the infrastructure and operations for you so you don't have to. So just to get a sense of where we are in the room, can I get a show of hands if you feel comfortable? Of course, you don't have to. But if you think your teams and your software application teams spend at least 25% of the time maintaining the operations of the infrastructure. Who thinks that's true? At least 25%? How about at least 50%? Got it. So just kind of in the theme of this talk, which is to think about both cost and value, just think about what would happen if you could reduce the amount of time the team spends on managing infrastructure, managing the operations, maintaining the applications, doing version management. If you could reduce that by half, or 3/4, or in some cases, just fully reduce it, and really just focus on writing the code. And there's a couple of sessions in this talk where we'll be talking about managed services, and that's really the game we're trying to play, which is help you focus on the application you're building. So Debo talked about Compute Engine, and that's on the left side of this screen, which is something that gives you full control over the servers that you're provisioning. And then at the other end of the spectrum is Cloud Functions, where you just write the code, and that function runs in the cloud, automatically provisioned, automatically scaling with events that trigger them. And then in between, we still give you choice for how much you want Google to manage for you. So let's talk a little bit about those. What what really is the choice? And I think it's a choice of what you feel comfortable managing. So in some cases, people love scheduling and people love looking at logs and doing the monitoring and having full control. But they're either applications that don't need that level of control, or the team just doesn't, that's not their expertise, that's not what they want to do. So the more and more we can manage for you, the more we believe you can focus on doing what's really important in the cloud. So how do we do this? So there's one word that really captures how we do this. It's plastics. We just do it with plastics. Containers. Containers are, the way to think about this is, in the legacy world, in bare metal servers, you're managing everything. You're managing the hardware, the racks, the operating systems, you're updating those, the libraries, making sure they're consistent across deployments. But what if we could manage the hardware for you? Great. So now you are able to rent servers. We can virtualize that to make that more efficient and rent servers through something like Compute Engine. But what if we could manage that even further and say, well, don't worry about the operating system. Don't worry about other security updates or library updates. Just deliver that kind of a hermetically sealed piece of code that contains all the library dependencies, all the code that you want to run. That's a container. And they don't interfere with each other, and so what you deploy is what runs. And then if we could manage that even further and say, you know what, don't even think about the library, just write the Python, write the code, write the JavaScript that you want to run. And if it's a common version or flavor of it, it'll run perfectly. We have a lot of experience doing this. So Google was one of the pioneers in container computing in Linux, and we've been doing this for over 10 years. And one of the important things, I'm not going to read all the benefits of being able to compute this way, but as you can abstract a lot of the dependencies out of your application, you get all these benefits, whether it's portability, speed, the velocity of your team, security, the dev team knowing that what gets shipped to production is going to run the way they tested it, and just simple scalability. So one thing we like to talk about at Google is sublinear scaling. So I don't know if you've heard this term, but it's the idea that as your business grows and as your application grows, your team doesn't need to scale in proportion with the success of your business. Certainly you wouldn't want it the other way around, which is every new user requires even more resources to support. So to give you a sense of how this works, over the last 10 years, using containers behind the scenes, we launch about 4 billion of them a week. Our ops fleet has grown 10 times faster than the ops team. And that's really great sublinear, order of magnitude sublinear scaling that we can achieve with this technology. So where does this appear in managed compute? Well, the first one I mentioned on the left hand of the spectrum is Google Kubernetes Engine. So what this really is, if you're familiar with Kubernetes, it's a way to manage a container cluster on VMs. And you could either run this, it's open source, it's one of the most popular GitHub repositories that has a lot of activity and kind of mindshare from the developer ecosystem. You can either run it yourself, or you can use GKE to let GKE run it for you, manage the cluster for you, update it, do all the security updates. And then because it's open source and portable, you can still interact with the cluster master through kube control, or kubectl, some people call it, directly. So the management can be invisible to you because you're still interacting with the cluster the way you're used to. If you'd like more management of your applications and you really don't want to deal with deploying applications into a cluster, you might choose something like Google App Engine. So I mentioned this is kind of in the middle of the spectrum. Here you can focus on writing code in common languages that might represent the big App Engine front-end app icon or the big App Engine back-end app icon here, and call other services as needed to do the job. But you're really just focusing on the versions of those applications and letting App Engine scale that application for you. And then finally, this is really exciting, is just Cloud Functions, where you can literally go in. There's some other great sessions where you'll see how short the code is, but just go into the UI, enter the code. It could be several lines that responds to an event. This event could be a new blob is put in your GCS bucket. I want to do something with it. I want to send it somewhere, maybe do a little bit of processing, zip it up. That could be a very simple, short and sweet Cloud Function where you don't need to worry about where that Cloud Function runs, how to provision it, how to set up the networking and the environment. Just give us the function and we'll run it for you and automatically scale it and only charge you for the resources it used. And so that's the important part, which is as you move through the spectrum, we're very keen on making sure you pay only for what you use. And of course, what you use varies based on how managed you want that infrastructure to be. So in the Kubernetes world, you're paying for the cluster. Those are the VMs that the cluster is running on. In the App Engine world, is paying for the instances that App Engine is spinning up for you that's running the back-end and front-end applications. And then in Cloud Functions, it's really just the management fee, the invocations of the function, and the actual compute cycles run by the Cloud Function. Great. So on this slide, what I want to capture is just what I've talked about, which is these different levels of management that you can choose from. And so if you are choosing Kubernetes Engine, you're still saying what you'd really value the control over some of the cluster management, over the application deployment, over setting that up. But if you don't value that control, or that's just not worth it to you, you can go through the spectrum and get to something like Cloud Functions, where just focus on writing the code and pay only for what you use. And there's no right answer. You may be using multiple of these technologies within your organization because some teams value one and other teams value the other. So I'm going to hand it back to Debo, who'll talk to you about cloud storage, and then I'll come back to talk to you about managed serverless platform.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Appreciate that. So storage. We've talked a little bit about compute, and storage is the very obvious analog for resources that you want to make sure you keep track of when it comes to your business and your value. Now, we talked a little bit before about all the costs involved with running your compute processes and workloads on-prem, and you have to think very similarly when you're thinking about your storage workloads. I won't go through all the different elements that we discussed before, but I'd of course like to call your attention very specifically to the idea that you have to think about unavailability as a cost. When you think about not being able to serve either internally or externally the different types of data that you have to process for people, that has a cost to your business. And you want to make sure that you're aware of that as well. And you have to think about repairability and other elements like that on premises as well. Moving forward, you also have to think about the value questions that you drive when you're making decisions with regards to storage on GCP. For example, can you handle multiple or single disk failures? How do you optimize for different types of storage use cases? How do you instantly access the different types of storage that may hold the data that's very important to you? And let's say that you want to go more granular. Let's say I want to focus on data stored in structures and buckets or rows in databases or in NoSQL databases and so on. How can I take advantage of all that from a storage perspective? So that brings us, of course, to Google Cloud Storage. And in a nutshell, it's very simple and elegant. Just focus on creating your storage buckets, put the data that you need into them, and of course, make sure that you control your access as necessary from a public, internal, or private perspective. And then, once you're done, remove that data and/or remove the bucket. Now, I want to take a minute to make sure that you guys understand the different classes of storage we offer, because that's one of the great values that we can provide and one of the great ways you can extract more value when thinking about your storage. When you think about multi-regional storage, that's the most frequently accessed data that you're going to have in your set. More or less, it's going to need to be accessed globally, and you want to have low end user latency. And so it's fantastic for those global data sets. Then, of course, you might move into more durable and more localized storage with regional. Let's say you need to do some analytics processing, or you need to look at some video encoding for a specific business or internal purposes. That's more of your regional data set or use case. Then we move into more of the less frequently accessed storage or data use cases with nearline and coldline. Nearline is for data you typically want to access once a month or less. So we're thinking about redundancy or backup use cases. And then, of course, coldline is more of an archival use case. So you want to make sure you think about your data storage in some of those different types of classes. Now, I've told you, just as I did with compute, that I have different ways for you to take advantage of the different things we provide in Google Cloud Storage. So once again, I'll divide them up into different types of behaviors and different types of tools you can use. On the behavior side, you definitely want to make sure that you choose the right storage class. You want to make sure that if you need to have high frequency data like websites or things like that, streaming media that you need other people to access, you want to focus more on the multi-regional section of the use cases. But if you got archival stuff, focus on putting it in coldline as soon as you can. You want to make sure that you properly tune your access. The last thing you want as a customer is to think about someone who you don't want accessing your data going into your storage buckets and gaining access. So definitely make sure you do that, because that, of course, increases the frequency with which you need to serve that data and might move it across classes as well. Then the last thing I'd tell you to do is turn on Object Lifecycle Management. Object Lifecycle Management is particularly useful because you can move your data across the storage classes I just introduced to you by creating policies that will do it automatically. So in some cases, if you're realizing that some of your documents have a life cycle and they're frequently accessed first, but the less and less relevant they get, the less and less they get accessed, you can set specific policies to move those things automatically from, say, multi-regional or regional to cold line or nearline. On the tools side of the house, you want to focus on using a single API for all of those storage classes. That's particularly useful because you don't have to change any of your code to access the storage buckets that you're creating, depending on what class they live in. Then we also have two things to help you move your data around. We have a cloud transfer appliance and we have a cloud transfer service. The appliance is particularly useful in helping you move your data from on-prem into GCS. The cloud transfer service is for moving it from one cloud to another. So both of those are particularly helpful. I encourage you to take full advantage of both of those. And finally, there's a storage growth plan to help you take care of the volatility that comes from dealing with storage costs. And I'll give you a few more comments on that more specifically. The idea behind the storage growth plan is to help you think about how I'm going to deal with the fact that storage costs may increase or decrease fairly unpredictably. So what we allow you to do is, if you're able to commit to $10,000 of spend over 12 months, then you can grow your stored data as you need to. That volatility will just happen, and you don't have to worry about overage during that time. At the end of that commit period, you can either do one of several options. The first saying, hey, at my peak usage, I'm going to focus on how much that costs and deal with the overages now and renew, or I'm going to keep my plan the same, settle up on all the overages I incurred over the past year because I was able to think about and monitor and predict over that period of time, and do this according to growth storage plan terms. Particularly useful when you have a lot of storage and a lot of media you have to take care of, but you have no idea at first what it's going to cost. So we've talked about the value of Google Cloud Storage. Let's talk again about the total costs. One of the things I'd imagine you'd really want to take advantage of, especially if you're just starting out with Google Cloud Storage, is to take advantage of the always free tier. That is, we give you a very fixed amount of regional storage, a whole bunch of operations that you can use in terms of moving your data around as necessary, and network egress that's always free, just so you can get an idea of how you want to move those workloads around. The other thing to think about is that costs decrease by access. So you can look at the prices per gigabyte month and see that multi-regional storage might be 0.3 cents per gigabyte month, but as you move down the storage class spectrum, you'll find that cold line storage is 0.04 cents. So if you optimize your workloads for that kind of storage costs, you can save a lot of money. Then, of course, is the third thing you need to think about, which is the fact that you can pay as you go or use a storage growth plan. We're giving you two options based on how much you might know and how predictable your workloads are. Now, you guys might be saying, Debo, this is great. This is super awesome. We got Google Cloud Storage, but I have to store things at way more granular levels than that. What are my choices? I don't want to overwhelm you guys, but we have quite a few. In fact, when you want to think about all the different choices you have, there's very, very ranging possibilities, from thinking about relational databases or NoSQL and in-memory databases, block and file storage, and of course the general purpose storage we were just talking about with Google Cloud Storage. The main thing I want you to think about here is that it's also a spectrum, very similar to what Stephen presented to you with compute. In some cases, the main value of using some of these services is that we manage some of the boilerplate work that you have to do for you in exchange for an increased cost in some senses, or a simple cost and a simple management structure in others. And BigQuery is included in there as one of our great best-in-class analysis tools that Stephen's going to talk to you about in just a moment. In any case, take advantage of all the different tools and behaviors you can use with Google Cloud Storage in order to get the most from your dollar in that sense. Now I'm going to hand it over to Stephen to talk a little bit more about the serverless platform and the analysis you can do with BigQuery.
Thanks, Debo. So the serverless data platform, there's many products that can be tied into a serverless data platform, but these three give you a sense of what we're trying to do here. And the echo should be loud and clear from the managed compute section that we just talked about. So BigQuery helps you just write queries. Don't worry about provisioning the database, the storage, the compute. Just analyze your data. Cloud PubSub lets you just send messages. Send the data where it needs to go. And then something like Cloud Dataflow is a serverless processing pipeline. So just process the data. Don't worry about how to provision that Hadoop cluster, for example. So BigQuery is a product I really love. This is not just me being biased. My wife is a user experience researcher on BigQuery, so this is not just me transitively loving BigQuery. But it's a really cool product, and what I love about this diagram is it shares the scale of it. So it's based on Dremel, Google technology that we use to power our internal analyses, and it's completely separated the federated storage of the data that it's analyzing and the analysis of that data. And what's especially cool here is distributed memory shuffle tier. So basically what that is, it's a way for compute to be completely stateless and analyze a lot of federated data, shuffling the memory, so that if any of the nodes go down, there's no problem, the analysis doesn't fail. If any of the storage goes down, it's no problem, it's highly durable, it's replicated. So we have exabyte scale storage on the left, and we've got petabyte, within minutes scale analysis on the right. And if you just think about that for a moment, I used to work at another company before I came to cloud, and it would be Monday night. There's a Wednesday metrics meeting that was very famous in the company, and I would hit contention with every other product manager trying to do analysis on our data warehouse because we didn't have a 1,000,000-core cluster that could scale 1,000 compute cores for my analysis. I was always running against other people on kind of node-based data warehouse systems. So this is I really love this product. And what you can use that with is you can use it as kind of an intermediate stop for where your data is going. So you might be using Cloud PubSub in your serverless data platform to send messages, maybe from your Internet of Things endpoints. Stand up a data flow pipeline so that you can process all that data going into BigQuery. And then maybe couple that with cloud machine learning so that you can train on the data, develop models that are reliable and give you the right insights from the data, and then run those very same models in Cloud ML to do prediction on the streaming data. So again, what we really want to focus on here is drive value from only the pieces that you want to work on. So just write the queries, just send the data, just create the pipelines, just develop the models for machine learning, and then only pay for what you use. So in the case of BigQuery, what you use is there's a charge for streaming ingestion, no charge for batch loading, and then there's a charge for the storage of the data and for the analysis of that data. And actually, the analysis comes in two flavors. On-demand, which is just as fast as what we see inside of Google, is something that just charges you for any on-demand storage based on data scanned. But if you have large BigQuery needs, you can also opt for a flat rate model where you ask us to reserve BigQuery slots for you. And those are dedicated slots that can be saved just for your jobs and also give you cost predictability over time. So that's something to consider. In the case of Cloud PubSub, just pay for the data that you sent in Cloud PubSub. Data flow is the data process plus the workers working on that data. And then cloud machine learning is just paying for the resources required to train your model and to apply it to data to create predictions. So end to end, what's really beautiful about a serverless data platform, you just focus on the through line. Where does the data come from? Where do you want it to go? And what transformations you want what transformations you want to apply to it on its way to, say, your data analyst or your scientist or your business manager in the visualization dashboard. So we have plenty of cases internally where we actually do very similar things. Comes into BigQuery. As a product manager, I do actually analysis of my own products in BigQuery and then power a data studio dashboard with it so I can see what's going on with my products. And it's all very, very easy because I don't need to worry about the resources. So we've done a lot of talking about total value, how to think about total value of moving to a more cloud-native way of doing things, and the costs that come with deriving that value. So I want to spend a little bit of time, and there's deeper sessions later and next, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about cost management tools. So one thing we've learned just talking to many different customers of different sizes is that regardless of the size of the customer, there's some common needs for cost management. And these are kind of captured here. There's the need to visualize what your costs are in a way that's meaningful to you. And then to hold the right people accountable. So if it's me or a Debo that's overspending on the BigQuery queries analyzing our products, that's something that we can analyze. And we can see where the costs are going, if we need to do anything differently. Same thing for compute and any other products. And then, of course, if you can hold people accountable, you might also want to be able to just have control for peace of mind and confidence that you can run your workloads in the cloud with predictable costs and with the right level of control. And then finally, you expect to get some kind of insights or intelligent recommendations about how to optimize your workloads. And again, this is true regardless of what size of customer you are. There's something that you should do before you get to this phase. And this is, there's a whole talk on this that a colleague, James Byers, will give on this. But the way we like to think about cost management is we want to make sure that you can manage your costs the way you organize your work. And this is, to a large extent, is an offline kind of discussion with your teammates, with your colleagues about how do we organize our work? How do we organize the value we're delivering as a company? Do we organize it by cost center? Do we organize it by apps, front end versus back end? And again, there's no right answer, and sometimes a hybrid model of organizing work and value is important. But once you have a sense of how you like to track the value you're delivering, then we offer tools to help you organize your cloud environment that way. So there's the organization, that could just be your domain name, mycompany.com, folders that might represent teams, applications, or cost centers. Those are ways to organize the projects. And if you're familiar with Google Cloud Project, it's kind of the fundamental unit of an environment where all resources within a project, you can see the cost for all resources in a project and the usage for all resources in a project. And you can also control access and policies via this hierarchy. And then finally, there are labels. So there may be things you want to be able to track across your organization. For example, security workloads, R&D workloads, other overhead workloads that might not belong to any single branch in the hierarchy. And so labels are something else to consider using. And the reason you want to do this is to be able to answer some of these evergreen questions. So talk about visibility, accountability, control, and intelligence. The questions behind those are kind of fundamental, and they tend not to vary that much. So what are the value and costs of my applications? What direction are those trending? Do I understand the drivers of those trends? And then finally, what might I do to optimize? So optimization might not simply be about reducing costs, but just making sure that there's, again, sublinear scaling. That growth in costs, if there's much higher growth in revenue, is absolutely fine. But growth in costs that might be greater than growth in revenue is something to keep an eye out for. And at any level of the organization, whether it's the CIO, the business owner, the engineering manager, the developer, these tend to be the same questions we always get support calls about and we get into discussions with customers about. It's just different zoom-ins on the fractal of cost management, and we provide tools to help provide any level of visibility that you might need. So here's just a summary of the tools, and there's, again, another in-depth session on cost management that'll go into these more deeply, but we provide out-of-the-box cost reports that you can slice and dice your costs any way you want within the Google Cloud Console. If you want a more detailed view of costs, for example, you really want to get into the labeling, and you really want to see things at kind of an hour to 2 hour granularity, there's detailed billing export, which sends all of your cost data into BigQuery, because that's the best place we think we can send it for analysis. And then for control, there's budgets, alerts, and quota. So one thing to keep in mind there is budgets and alerts are kind of a lagging indicator. What you spend is a little bit of a lagging indicator for cost control. Quota, on the other hand, is quota set on usage by user, by certain sets of permissions, and that's proactive. That gets in front of the spending. But depending on the application, whether it's production, testing, you can imagine that some usage of quota is more appropriate than others, and some usage of budgets and alerts are more appropriate than others. And then finally, there are recommendations. So different products have their recommendations about how to optimize. One that Debo talked about was VM right-sizing recommendations. And there are other recommendations like that we can provide. Insight into how you use your committed use discounts, for example. And those just help you figure out if there are opportunities to optimize your spending or just reconfigure the way you're doing things to get the most out of Google Cloud. So to recap, I'll kind of bring you back to how Debo introduced the session, and we talked about comparing value to cost. And in particular, just trying to seed the thought that the usual way of looking at this is a little bit inadequate. And the insidious thing about this is the way I always think about things, is just, oh, how does the cost change? It's always harder to think about how the value changes or how the culture of your team changes or how the way you build things and maintain them changes. But if we can move from this model of thinking about costs and value to a model that really thinks about what you get from moving to a very flexible compute platform, a highly kind of diversified and tailorable storage platform, managed compute services, a serverless data platform, and many other products that we offer and APIs that we offer, then what I think is the most exciting part of this discussion is how the value trend changes and just kind of the gap that it opens between what you're able to deliver to your own customers and what costs you're able to reduce on the back end. So to tie it up, this is why we call ourselves Google Cloud Platform. And we think the more and more we can be the platform that you're building value on, the more you can focus on building what's next for your business. And that's why Debo and I are at Google Cloud. It's really exciting. People always ask us, why are we billing product managers? And it's because this is actually a really exciting part about our job. And we really look forward to working with you as you do that. So before we break, I mentioned some other deep dive sessions. A colleague of ours, Manish Dalwadi, is great giving an intermediate talk on how to save money with Compute Engine and how to get value out of Compute Engine. Highly recommend that talk. We have another colleague, Matt Leonard. He's doing a panel with several industry leaders, one from Etsy, a specialist leader from Deloitte, and a couple others on cost control and financial governance. And that'll be a good one for you to get a sense of the different methods of having good financial governance and cost control, depending on your organizational needs. And then on Wednesday, I'm giving a talk with that Deloitte specialist leader on actually using the monitoring and cost control tools that we offer as the cost management team. So we'd look forward to seeing you there. And then finally, another session that we'd like to recommend is one run by our colleague, Phil Coletti. That's Phil with 2 L's. And that's establishing financial governance controls on GCP. And he's giving that with Aurélie Fonteny, who's a product manager on Quota. And then we'll be at the Cost Management Showcase all week. There's an Ask the Experts booth where you can schedule time with one of the Google Cloud staffers who are here. And then finally, if there's one URL you want to write down, it's cloud.google.com/cost-management. And we'll be posting all the talks on cost management there and other resources there. So that's a great kind of hub for cost management resources.